The rain came first, then the cold behind it, then the smell of wet wool and tallow smoke that meant the Bellamy house was shutting its door for the night. Clara Wren stood outside that door anyway, in the lane, because the door had shut on her 20 minutes before, and she had not yet decided where else to go. She was 25 and had spent most of those years being useful to people who did not thank her for it. She was not pretty in the way that got a woman noticed. She was not plain in the way that got her pitied either. She was the kind of woman a room settled around without seeing, the way water settles around a stone. She mended linen for 3 houses in the village and 1 great house on the hill, when the great house troubled to send its baskets down. She could turn a collar, reset a hem, save a shirt that any other woman would have called past saving. It was not a grand gift. It kept her fed, most weeks. The lane that night was going to take somebody before morning, if somebody did not stop it. She did not know that yet, not in words. She only knew the wind had a certain edge to it, the edge that came before snow, and that her aunt had put her out for the evening over a shirt collar turned wrong, and that she had nowhere she needed to be until dawn, which was its own kind of freedom. She walked toward the crossroads, because the crossroads had a lean-to, an old market shelter with 3 walls and half a roof, and it was dry, or as dry as anything was that night. She had slept there before. She was not ashamed of it. Shame, she had found, was a thing other people tried to hand you, and you did not have to take it. The lean-to was not empty. She heard it before she saw it, a thin sound, worn down to almost nothing, the sound a kettle makes right before it goes off the boil, and then does not. She stood very still in the dark and listened, because a woman alone at a crossroads at night learns to listen before she moves. It was a child, not a child who could yet walk or talk. A baby, wrapped in a scrap of blue wool gone grey with wet, laid in the driest corner of the shelter, as if someone had chosen the driest corner with great care, and then left anyway. Clara did not call out. There was no one to call to. She knelt instead, and the wool was cold under her hands, colder than wool should be, and under the wool the child was colder still. She did not think about what it would cost her to take a foundling home. She thought about it the way she thought about a torn collar, as a thing in front of her that needed mending, and she began. She opened her own shawl and put the child against her skin, because she had heard once, from a woman who had lost 3 of her own, that skin was the fastest way to give back warmth that had been taken. She did not have milk to give it. She had nothing to give it but her body and her walking, so she walked, fast, back toward the village, back toward a room that was not truly hers, that she rented from a woman who would not thank her for bringing home a stranger's trouble. She did not know as she walked that she was watched. At the edge of the green, where the road forked toward the great house and its long dark avenue of elms, a man stood beside a hired horse that had gone lame an hour before and left him stranded exactly where he had not meant to be. He was not dressed as a gentleman that night. He wore a plain coat, mud to the knee, and he had told the one man he had passed that his name was Fenn, and that he was a land agent come to look over some property before its owner troubled himself to visit it. Both of those things were true enough to pass, and neither of them was the whole truth. He saw the woman come out of the crossroads shelter at a near run, something clutched inside her shawl, her head down against the wind. He saw her stop once, only once, to settle whatever she carried more firmly, and he heard her say, to no one, in a voice pitched low and certain, that it would be all right now, that she had it, that it would be all right. He did not step forward. He did not call out. He only watched her go, and something in him that had gone very quiet a long time ago, quiet the way a house goes quiet after a death, opened its eyes. She did not know then that the man at the crossroads that night was the Duke of Ashcroft, whose land she had just crossed, whose name was on the deed to the very shelter that had kept the child dry. She did not know that he would remember the exact set of her shoulders for a long time after. She did not know that a single unwatched act, performed for no one and expecting nothing, was about to be the only proof of character that mattered to a man who had stopped believing such proof existed. The child was alive by morning. That was the first thing Clara Wren knew for certain, and for a while it was the only thing she needed to know. She had sat up with it through the worst of the night, feeding it milk warmed and thinned and dripped from a twist of cloth, because there was no wet nurse in that house, and no money for one. She had wrapped it in her own second shawl, the good one, the one she had been saving to turn into a coat before winter proper set in. She did not think of that as a sacrifice. She thought of it as the shawl doing, finally, something worth doing. By the grey edge of dawn she carried the child to the parish, because a foundling belonged to the parish by law, whatever Clara's alms thought about it. The parish clerk, a narrow man with a narrow view of expense, looked at the babe and looked at Clara and said the workhouse would take it in, that such children generally were taken in, that it was not for a single woman with no means to keep it. "I have kept it since midnight," Clara said. "I can keep it a while longer." "On what? On what I have?" The clerk did not think much of what she had. He said as much. Clara did not argue further. She simply did not hand the child over, and there is a kind of refusal that looks like patience, and is in fact iron, and the clerk, faced with it, found he had other business that morning, and would return to the matter later. She took the baby home. Her landlady, a widow named Fisk, who kept a hard bargain but not an unkind one, stood in the doorway with her arms folded, and said she ran a respectable house, not a foundling hospital. "She will be no trouble to you," Clara said. "I will pay what I owe, and a little more. For the room, for the trouble of it. With what money? I will find it." Mrs. Fisk looked at her for a long moment, the kind of long moment that decides things, and then said that Clara had always paid what she owed, and that this was not nothing in a tenant, and that she supposed a cradle could go in the corner if it came to that. It was not warmth exactly. It was the nearest thing to warmth that Mrs. Fisk generally offered, and Clara took it gladly. She did not know that week why the parish clerk did not press the matter further. She did not know why a note came from the great house on the hill, unsigned, instructing that a basket of linen mending be sent to Clara Wren specifically, and no other woman in the village, at double her usual rate. She did not know why. A fortnight later, a physician she had never engaged and could never have paid appeared at Mrs. Fisk's door to look the child over, examine her lungs, leave a bottle of tonic, and depart before Clara could ask who had sent him. She thought it was luck. She thought the world had, for once, turned a kind face toward her by accident. She was not entirely wrong to be glad of it. She was entirely wrong about the accident. The man calling himself Fenn had ridden back to his own house that first morning, still turning her over in his mind. The set of her shoulders, the flatness of her voice when she told the clerk she would find the money. He was accustomed to people performing goodness for him once they learned who he was. He was not accustomed to a woman performing it in the dark, for a stranger's child, believing herself entirely unseen. He had sent for his steward before he had even changed his coat. Mr. Halloway had known the Duke of Ashcroft for 11 years, and had long since stopped being surprised by him, but he raised an eyebrow at the instructions all the same. Linen mending, quietly, at a generous rate, from a particular woman in the village, no explanation given. No name attached to the order beyond the house's own. Shall I say who asks for her particularly? Your Grace? You shall not say anything of the kind, and if she asks, then you will tell her the house required a steady hand, and that hers had been recommended. This was true. It simply left out by whom, and how the recommendation had been formed, in the dark, at a crossroads, by a man who had told her his name was Fenn, and had not yet found the moment to unsay it. He told himself, at first, that this was ordinary charity, the kind any landholder owed his tenants. He had done such things before, quietly, and asked not to be named for them, because a debt repaid with fanfare stopped being charity, and became a transaction, and he had had enough of transactions in his life to last him. But he found within a week that he was asking Halloway for news of her the way another man might ask after the weather, too often to be casual, too carefully phrased to be nothing. He did not go to her himself. Not yet. He told himself there was no cause. He was a duke, and she was a mender of linen with a foundling in a borrowed cradle, and there was no scene in which those two facts met without scandal attaching itself to her, not to him. Scandal cost her more than it ever cost men like him. He understood that arithmetic well enough to leave her alone. He did not leave her alone entirely. He rode past the crossroads shelter twice more that month, telling himself he was inspecting the state of his own property, and each time he found some reason to have the roof mended a little further, the walls set a little straighter, as though the shelter itself deserved thanks for having kept her dry the night she needed it. Halloway, watching all this with the patient amusement of a man who had served a grave household for a decade, kept his own counsel and his own smile, and told Mrs. Prosser, the housekeeper, only that his Grace had taken an interest in a mending woman in the village, and that she, Mrs. Prosser, would do well to have a look at the young woman herself before saying anything to anyone. The great house sent for Clara properly at the start of the second month, not for a basket of linen this time, but to come up to the hill and work 3 days a week among the household's own stores, where the light was better and the pay steadier. It was Mrs. Prosser who received her at the kitchen door, a square, capable woman with grey in her hair and no patience for foolishness, and Mrs. Prosser looked Clara over the way a farmer looks over a horse he has been told is sound. "You'll have heard we're particular here," Mrs. Prosser said. "I've heard the pay is fair. It is fair because His Grace insists on it. He does not insist on much, but he insists on that." Mrs. Prosser did not say who had proposed Clara's name for the work, and Clara, busy counting the good fortune of steady wages, did not think to ask. She brought the child with her some days, when Mrs. Fisk had errands of her own, and set the cradle in a corner of the mending room, where the light fell warm through a tall window, and the great house's linen passed through her hands one piece at a time, and she did not think of herself as anything but a woman doing careful work for careful pay. She did not know that the Duke of Ashcroft had, from a distance, already decided that she was the only person he had met in 3 years who had not once asked him for anything. The mending room in the great house had a window that looked west over the park, and on a clear afternoon in the 3rd week Clara was working there when the door opened, and a man came in without ceremony. In his shirt sleeves, a book under one arm, clearly expecting the room to be empty. He was not what she had pictured when the maids spoke of him. He was not handsome in any way a ballad would trouble to describe, hard about the jaw, a nose that had been broken once and set imperfectly, dark eyes that looked as though they did a great deal of thinking and very little resting. He stopped short in the doorway. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I was told this room was free at this hour." "It is nearly always free at this hour," Clara said. "I am the reason it is not today." He looked at her a moment longer than the remark required. "You are the mending woman Mrs. Prosser speaks of." "I am a mending woman. I could not say what Mrs. Prosser speaks of me." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, and did not stay long enough to be called one. He asked, because he could not entirely stop himself, what she was working on, and she told him plainly. A torn him in a good coat, ruined by a nail in a stable door, easily set right if the man who owned it had not tried to mend it himself first with a bootlace, and made the whole business worse. And if the man who owned it were foolish enough to have done that himself, then I would tell him so, and mend it anyway. You would tell him so first. I would. A man ought to know when he's made work harder than it needed to be. He laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, as though laughter were a door in him that had swollen shut from disuse, and had just been forced an inch. Clara noted it and said nothing, because she had already learned in 3 weeks in that house that the master of it did not laugh often, and that the maids treated any instance of it as an event worth reporting below stairs by supper. He asked after the child then, nodding once toward the cradle in the corner, and Clara answered without embarrassment, without asking why a duke's grace should care to know, because she had decided some weeks before that kindness required no explanation, and she saw no reason questions about it should require one either. "She is thriving," Clara said. "She was not thriving a month ago." "No," he said. "I imagined she was not." He did not say how he knew that, and Clara, hemming steadily, did not think to press it. He came into that room more often after that, always with some plain excuse, a book he needed from the shelf behind her, a window he wished opened, and each time the conversation was short, plain, and left something behind it. She learned that he had inherited the title young and unwilling, that his father had been a hard man, and his mother had died before Clara was born, that he had once been engaged to a woman of excellent family who had wept beautifully in company and been cruel to a servant girl in private, and that he had broken it off at some cost to his own name, rather than marry a woman who mistook kindness for weakness. He did not tell her all of that in one sitting. It came in pieces over weeks, the way a stream wears a channel, a little each time, never in a flood. She, in turn, told him things she had not said aloud to anyone. That her parents had died of a fever when she was young, that an aunt and uncle had raised her the way one raises a useful animal, fed and housed and worked, and that she had left that house the day she turned 21, because staying had stopped being safer than going. She said it plainly, without asking for pity, and he noted, as he had noted the first night at the crossroads, that she seemed entirely unpractised at asking for anything. Once, in October, he brought her a coat, not new, one of the household's own stores, saying only that a spare hung idle in the linen press, and it seemed a waste when the mending room ran cold in the mornings. She thanked him for it plainly, and did not make more of it than it was, and he found, walking away, that he wished she had made a little more of it, only so he might have stayed a moment longer in the room to hear her do it. He had not told her about the crossroads. He had not told her that Mr. Fenn, the traveller with the lame horse, and the Duke of Ashcroft, who now stood in doorways finding reasons to linger, were the same man. He told himself there would be a right time for it. He was not yet certain there would be a right way. Lady Augusta Renshaw arrived at Ashcroft the first week of November, as she did most years, to spend the worst of the cold season under her cousin's roof, and remind the household, gently and continually, of the precise order of things. She was Julian's father's niece, widowed young, handsome in the brittle way of a woman who had once been beautiful and intended to be treated as though she still were. She kept a laugh like 3 small bells struck in sequence, and she used it most often just after saying something unkind, as if the laugh might soften the blow after it had already landed. She noticed Clara within the first evening, the way a hawk notices a field mouse before the mouse has done anything to be noticed for. And who, she asked Mrs. Prosser, in the tone of a woman asking after a stray dog, is the girl in the mending room, and why does my cousin trouble to visit her there? Mrs. Prosser said only that Miss Wren mended linen for the house, and that his Grace looked in on the household's work generally, and Lady Augusta smiled her 3-bell smile, and said she was certain that was all it was. It came to a head at a small supper Julian gave for 2 neighbouring families the 2nd week of December, an evening Clara had not been meant to attend at all, until a torn flounce on Mrs. Halloway's own gown sent Clara upstairs at the last minute with a needle, and Julian, coming upon her in the hall afterward, asked her plainly to stay and take a chair, because he saw no reason a woman capable enough to save an evening's dress should be sent back to the kitchen for it. Lady Augusta watched this from across the room with her glass untouched. "How resourceful you are, Miss Wren," she said, when the company had settled, pitching her voice just far enough to carry. "A mender of gowns one moment, a guest at table the next. One wonders what else you might mend your way into, given time and a duke's good nature." The room went a shade quieter. Clara set down her fork with great care. "I mend what needs mending, my lady. I have never asked to be paid twice for it." "No," Lady Augusta said, and laughed her 3 bells. "I dare say you have learnt that asking is unnecessary, when a man's pity does the asking for you." "It is not pity that feeds a child through a fever," Clara said. "I have not found pity useful for much beyond conversation." Lady Augusta's smile thinned. She turned the talk, as such women do, to the matter of the foundling itself, wondering aloud whether it was quite proper for a household of consequence to be seen indulging a servant's charity project, whether it did not encourage every beggar in the parish to leave their trouble on the great house's doorstep, whether Miss Wren had considered that gentleman's kindness, once spent on strays, tended to run thin before it reached anyone deserving. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not weep, though the room was watching her in the particular way a room watches a woman it expects to break. "I have found," she said, "that the deserving and the undeserving look a good deal alike when they are cold. I have never yet been able to tell them apart by their manners, only by their need." It was Julian who spoke next, and his voice, when it came, was very quiet and very final. "Miss Wren has done this house more honest good in 3 months than I have seen done in 3 years, cousin. I would take it as a kindness if you found some other subject for the evening." Lady Augusta laughed once more, but the bells had gone slightly flat, and she found, for the rest of the supper, that she had a great deal to say to the family on her right, and nothing further to say to Clara at all. Clara did not thank Julian for it afterward. She told him plainly in the hall that she had not needed defending, that she had held her own before he spoke, and would have gone on holding it. "I know," he said. I did not do it for your sake alone. He did not explain what he meant by that, and she, tired and still stinging under her calm, did not ask. The letter came from Ashcroft Village 3 days before Christmas, in a hand Clara had not seen in 4 years, and would have known anywhere. Her aunt, Ruth Bellamy, wrote seldom and never without cause, and the cause this time filled 2 crowded pages. They were coming to fetch her. Her Uncle Josiah had business that made her presence necessary. Urgent business, the letter said. Business that could not wait past the new year. And Clara was to understand that as her only living kin, they retained a rightful say in her situation, unmarried and unprotected as she was, and that a respectable arrangement had been made for her with a Mr. Pruitt of the town, a mercer of good standing, who was willing to overlook her want of fortune in exchange for a settlement that would clear a debt her uncle had long carried against Mr. Pruitt's late father's estate. Clara read it twice at Mrs. Fisk's small table, the child asleep in the cradle by the fire, and felt something in her go very still and very cold, colder than the crossroads had been. She had not seen the Bellamys in 4 years, because the parting had not been a gentle one. Her uncle had struck her once, the year she turned 20, for refusing to hand over wages she had earned mending for a neighbour, and her aunt had watched it happen and said nothing, and Clara had left within the month and never gone back. She had built since then a life that owed them nothing. She had thought that door closed for good. It was not closed. It had only been waiting. She did not answer the letter that night. She sat instead with the child's small weight against her, and thought about what it would mean if her uncle's claim held any weight in law, which it might, an unmarried woman, without a father's protection, being a thing the law still counted as somebody's property to dispose of. And she thought about Mr. Pruitt, whom she had never met and did not care to, and she thought longest of all about what it would cost the household on the hill, and the man in it, if her family arrived there making noise about debts and claims and a mercer's marriage. She decided, before the fire burned down, that she would go quietly rather than let that noise reach Ashcroft's door. She would settle it herself, away from the great house, away from Julian, away from anything that might be dragged through it on her account. She wrote to Mrs. Prosser the next morning, not to Julian, saying only that family matters called her away for a time, and that she hoped the mending would be forgiven its lapse until she returned, if she returned. She did not say where she was going. She did not trust herself to write his name at all, in case her hand shook and gave away more than the sentence intended. She packed what little she owned, the child's things folded with more care than her own, and told Mrs. Fisk she would send for the cradle when she was settled, and did not let herself imagine what settled might come to mean now. She did not know, walking to the crossroads to wait for the carrier's cart that would take her toward her uncle's house, that Mrs. Prosser had read her letter twice, gone very white, and sent a boy running up to the hill within the hour. She did not know that Julian, reading it in his study with the fire gone low, had stood so fast his chair scraped the length of the floor, and said only one word, and that word was her name. Julian rode down to the village himself rather than send Halloway, because there are errands a man does not trust to anyone else, and found Mrs. Fisk at her door with her arms folded and her face grim. "Gone this morning, Your Grace." "On the carrier's cart, toward her uncle's," she said, though she'd not say more than that, left half her wage behind too for the room, as though she meant to make it square before she went. Did she say when she might return? She said if, not when. He did not go after her that day. He told himself, riding back up the long avenue in the dark, that a man barging after a woman who had chosen to go was no better than the family dragging her back by other means, and he had promised himself, since the crossroads, that whatever he did for her would be done without taking anything from her in return, including her right to walk away from him unpursued. He was wrong about one thing only, and it took Mrs. Prosser to correct him. She did not leave because she wished to go, "Your Grace," Mrs. Prosser said, standing in his study with her hands folded the way she stood when she meant to say something he might not want to hear. She left because she believed her leaving would spare this house some trouble. I have known that girl 3 months, and I have not once seen her act for her own comfort. I do not expect she has started now. Julian sat a long while after Mrs. Prosser left him, turning that over. He had spent 3 months being careful of her pride, careful not to press, careful not to let his interest become a burden she could not set down. He saw now, too late by some days, that his carefulness had let her walk straight into a house that had struck her once already, believing herself entirely alone in it, because he had never told her plainly enough that she was not. It was the housekeeper, in the end, who told her the rest, though it was not by design. Clara had gone to her uncle's house, and found it colder than memory had made it, her aunt thinner, her uncle louder Mr., Pruitt already seated at the table as though the matter were settled before she had crossed the threshold. She had not yet said no. She had only said she needed a day to think, and her uncle had said a day was more than the matter deserved, and the argument had gone on past dark. It was into that argument 2 days later that a letter arrived from Ashcroft, addressed to Josiah Bellamy, informing him with cold civility that the debt he owed the late Mr. Pruitt's estate had been settled in full by an anonymous party some weeks prior, a fact her uncle had somehow neglected to mention to anyone, least of all to Clara, because the settlement had removed the one lever he had ever truly held over the younger Mr. Pruitt's willingness to overlook Clara's want of fortune. Clara did not understand the letter's meaning at first. It was her aunt, of all people, cornered and resentful and wanting company in her resentment, who told her the rest, that the debt had in fact been cleared back in October, quietly, through a solicitor in the county town, and that word in the village said the money had come down from the great house on the hill, though no name had ever been put to it. Clara sat very still when she heard that. October, before the supper with Lady Augusta, before the coat left idle in the linen press, nearly as far back as the physician who had come unbidden to look at a child no one had told him about. She thought, with a coldness that was not entirely unkind, of every piece of luck that had fallen into her path since the night at the crossroads, the mending sent for at double rate, the physician, the debt cleared without a name attached to it, and understood. All at once, and far too late to feel anything but foolish for not seeing it sooner, that none of it had been luck at all. She did not weep. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, very still, and thought of the man in the doorway of the mending room who had laughed once, unpractised, and asked after a child he should have had no cause to know was thriving, and she understood that whoever had done all this had done it without once asking to be thanked for it, which was, she had always believed, the only kind of goodness worth calling by that name. She left her uncle's house within the hour, on foot, because there was no cart until morning, and she had never yet let weather stop her from getting somewhere she had decided to be. She arrived at Ashcroft after dark, cold to the bone, and asked Mrs. Prosser plainly whether it was true that his Grace had settled her uncle's debt in October. Mrs. Prosser, who had promised no one her silence on this particular point, said that it was, and that it had been done the same week the physician came, and that his Grace had asked, as he always asked, not to be named for it. Why? Clara said. Would a man do all that and never say so? You would have to ask him that yourself, Miss Wren. I only keep his house. I do not keep his reasons. Clara found him in his study within the hour, and it was there, with the fire low and the household gone quiet around them, that he told her the whole of it, plainly, because he had decided on the ride down to the village, and back that a confession delayed further was a cruelty he no longer had the right to commit. My name, he said, is not the only thing I have kept from you. 3 months ago, before you knew me at all, a man calling himself Fen stood at the crossroads on a bad horse and watched a woman carry a dying child home in her own shawl, expecting nothing for it, not even to be seen doing it. I was that man. I wanted to know what you would do when you believed no one of any consequence was watching. You did the only thing worth doing, and you did it as though it cost you nothing, though I have seen since exactly what it did cost you. Clara did not answer at once. She stood very still, her hands, for once, not entirely steady. You watched me, she said, and said nothing. For 3 months. I did not know how to say it without it becoming a debt you felt bound to repay. I have watched debts like that curdle into something neither party can bear. I did not want to be owed by you. I wanted only to know you, and I found I could not do that honestly while keeping the crossroads a secret, and so I have kept both, badly, and I am sorry for it. You paid my uncle's debt. I did. He would have used it to sell you to a man you had never met. I could not undo the law that lets him try. I could only make certain he had no further cause. You never meant me to know that either. No, I did not do it to be thanked. I would have been glad, in fact, if you had never learned my part in it at all, provided the debt stayed cleared. Clara looked at him a long moment, weighing that the way she weighed a torn seam, for what could be mended, and what could not. I do not like being managed, she said at last, even kindly, even by a man who means well by it. I know. I have thought of little else on the ride down and back tonight. I will not ask you to forgive the manner of it. I will only ask that you let me stop, from tonight, and be honest with you plainly, whatever it costs either of us. And if I say I want time before I answer anything at all, then you shall have it. I will not ask you again until you are ready to be asked, and your no, when it comes if it comes, will cost you nothing with me. I would rather have your honest no in the spring than a yes given tonight, out of gratitude for a debt you never asked me to clear. Clara did not cry, though something in her chest had gone tight enough that crying would have been the easier road. She only nodded once and said she would think on it, and he let her go without another word, because he had meant what he said about not pressing her, and a man who meant such things did not undo them the first time it was hard to keep his word. The Bellamys came to Ashcroft on the 4th day of January, in a hired trap that had cost them more than they could easily spare, because Josiah Bellamy had decided, once the debt that bound Mr. Pruitt to him had vanished, that there was still one asset left to him worth the journey, and that asset was his niece. He came to the kitchen door first, as a man of his standing was made to do at a house of that size, and demanded to see Clara Wren on a family matter that would not wait, and Mrs. Prosser, reading the set of his jaw, put him and his wife in the small morning room, rather than let them stand about the servants' hall, arguing where anyone might carry the tale below stairs. Clara came down when she was fetched, calm, her hands steady, and shut the morning-room door behind her, because whatever was said in that room she intended to say and hear without an audience. "You left my house before we had settled anything," Josiah said, without greeting. "You will come back with us today. Mr. Pruitt is willing to overlook the delay, given the circumstances. provided we do not delay further. There is nothing to settle, uncle. I told you I needed a day, and in that day I learned the debt you meant to use against me was already cleared. You have no further claim to press. I am your only kin living. The law gives me a say in your situation whether you like the shape of it or not, and I say you will come home and be sensible, and be married to a man who can keep you, instead of playing house among strangers with somebody's cast-off foundling. She is not a cast-off. She is mine, in every way that matters, and I will not leave her, and I will not leave this house, and I will not marry a man I have met twice, for the sake of a debt that no longer exists to be settled. You will do as I tell you, girl, while you are under my roof in the law's eyes, if nowhere else. Ruth Bellamy, silent until then, said her husband was only thinking of Clara's welfare, that a woman alone with a foundling and no husband was no woman to be envied, and Clara turned to her aunt with a steadiness that had cost her a great deal to build over 4 years and cost her nothing at all to spend now. You watched him strike me once, aunt, and said nothing. I do not need your account of my welfare. I have kept myself and a child besides on honest work since I left your house, and I have never once asked either of you for anything in the years since. I am asking you nothing now either. I am telling you no. It was at that word that the door, not quite latched, gave a fraction under the pressure of a man standing just outside it, a man who had come in from the stable yard not 5 minutes before, heard raised voices from the morning room, and stopped in the passage rather than interrupt what was plainly a family matter, though every instinct in him wanted to walk through that door and put himself between Clara Wren and whoever was making her voice go that flat and careful. He heard the word before he saw her say it, no plain, unhurried, entirely her own, offered without a tremor to a man who had struck her once, and clearly expected even now that his claim outweighed her word. Julian did not knock. He opened the door. I believe, he said, into the silence that followed, that Miss Wren has given you her answer, and given it plainly. I would take it as a courtesy if you did not require her to give it twice. Josiah Bellamy, faced with a duke in his own morning room, found a good deal less to say than he had brought with him. He blustered a sentence about a family's rights and a niece's duty, and Julian, who had spent a lifetime being spoken to by men who mistook volume for authority, let him finish, and then said, very quietly, that Miss Wren was of age, unindebted to him or to Mr. Pruitt, and under no obligation the law or anyone else could enforce, and that the Bellamys were welcome to take tea before their journey home, but that the matter of Clara's future was, from that morning, entirely her own to settle, with no one's claim standing over it, including, he added, his own. They left within the hour, without tea. Ruth Bellamy looked back once from the trap, at Clara standing straight in the doorway with the child on her hip, and said nothing at all, which was, from her, very nearly an apology. Clara turned to Julian once the trap had gone down the avenue and out of sight. "You heard that," she said. "All of it. I heard the last of it. I heard you tell him no before I ever opened the door. I did not come in to answer for you. I came in because I did not think you should have to say it twice to make it hold. I would have made it hold myself. I know," he said. "I have never once doubted that you would." She looked at him a long moment, the winter light cold and clean through the window behind him, and found that whatever caution had kept her answer folded up since the night in his study had, in the last quarter hour, quietly come undone. "I have thought about the spring," she said. "You said you would ask again in the spring. I did say that. I find I do not want to wait for it. He crossed the room to her, slow, giving her every chance to step back if she meant to, and she did not step back. He took her hand, the mended, roughened hand of a woman who had spent a life sewing other people's tears shut, and drew the glove from it, finger by finger, slow, as if the moment deserved to be taken apart properly, rather than hurried through, and pressed his mouth once to her bare knuckles, and said her name, her whole name, the way a man says a thing he intends to go on saying for the rest of his life. "I love you," he said, "for exactly what you were the night I first saw you, when you believed no one of any consequence was watching. I have not found a single hour since to love you less for. I set one condition," Clara said, "before I answer you properly. Name it. Never manage me again, however kindly meant. Speak to me plainly, whatever it costs you, and I will do the same for you, whatever it costs me. That," he said, "is not a hard condition to keep. I find I have grown tired of every other kind of speaking." "Then yes," she said. It was the only word she needed, and she did not trouble to dress it up any further than that. They were married quietly, at the end of that same winter, in the small stone church at the crossroads end of the village, with Mrs. Fiske in the second pew and Mrs. Prosser weeping without shame in the first, and the child whom Clara had named Alice carried up the aisle in Mrs. Prosser's own arms, because Clara had asked her to do it, and Mrs. Prosser had not been able to answer for the tears long enough to refuse. Lady Augusta did not attend. She had removed herself, before the banns were even read twice, to her sister's house in the north, where she wrote occasional letters full of complaints about the climate, and none at all about the cousin whose favour she had once counted on and lost through her own tongue. Julian read her letters when they came, and answered them politely, and never once mentioned Clara in his replies, which Lady Augusta understood, correctly, as the whole of his opinion on the matter. Josiah Bellamy did not trouble Ashcroft again. He wrote once, the following autumn, asking after his niece's health in a tone that cost him a great deal of pride to produce. And Clara answered him civilly and briefly, and sent, without being asked, a small sum toward his household's winter coal, because she had decided that her own dignity did not require his ruin, only his distance, and she had learned, from a man who asked never to be thanked for his kindnesses, that the quietest generosity was often the truest kind. A year to the night from the crossroads, the snow came down thick and early over Ashcroft, and Julian found his wife by the nursery fire with Alice asleep against her shoulder, a scrap of blue wool, mended so many times over that no thread of the original remained, folded across the arm of the chair where it had lived, by Clara's own insistence, in every room the child slept in since. He sat beside her without a word, and took her bare hand in his, and she let her head rest against him, and neither of them spoke for a long while, because there are moments a house holds so gently that speech would only spoil them. "She will never remember that night," Clara said at last, looking down at the sleeping child. "She will never know how close a thing it was." "No," Julian said. "But we will. That is enough remembering for one house to carry." Outside, the wind rose once and settled, the way it had risen and settled a year before at a crossroads shelter 3 miles down the road, and somewhere a bird called once into the falling snow, and was still. A kindness done in the dark, expecting no witness and no reward, had found, after all, both. It is not the watched hour that proves a person's worth. It is the hour they believed belonged to no one but themselves.